Welcome to our latest webinar and thank you for joining us. I hope you're all well and staying safe. I'm going to be handing over to our expert speaker very shortly, but to begin, a couple of notes regarding the webinar platform we are using. The main thing you need to know is that you can direct questions to our speaker for today via the Q&A option on your toolbar at any time throughout the webinar. The toolbar is likely to be at the foot of your screen. If you cannot see the toolbar, just hover around the bottom of your screen and it will appear. Once located, simply type your question into the text box provided and click or tap Submit. We will run through questions with the speaker once the talk is complete. Secondly, you are all on mute. As with all of our webinars, this is nothing against you. It just helps the webinar run smoothly without distractions or background noise. The webinar is being recorded and will be available in the coming days via our website, YouTube channel, and if you've opted in to receive emails from us, you will receive an email with the recording link. For those watching the webinar as recording, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time using the details on your screen now. So very quickly, you're watching a Society for the Environment webinar. We hold the two professional registers for environmental professionals, the Chartered Environmentalist or CIEEM register, and the Registered Environmental Technician or RM Tech register. The Society operates as an umbrella organisation, currently made up of 24 professional bodies known as our licensed members. All of these professional bodies hold a licence granted by the Society to award the CIEEM registration to their members. 3 of these also offer the RM Tech registration, which are now highlighted. To become a CIEEM or RM Tech, you will need to be a member of and apply via one of these professional bodies. You'll be joining nearly 7,500 registrants from across sectors and disciplines, and as of this month, we have registered 10,000 chartered environmentalists in total. If you want to find out more, please visit socenv.org.uk or inquire with the relevant professional body directly. So, onto the webinar itself. The aim of our numerous webinar series is to increase knowledge transfer opportunities for environmental professionals and interested parties. This webinar is the first part of a special series running this week in celebration of World Environment Day, which is this Friday, the 5th of June. Each year, we champion World Environment Day in the UK and beyond. This year, the global theme for World Environment Day is biodiversity, a topic which registered environmental professionals agree is hugely important for the environment, both currently and looking to the future. Today, we are focusing on the very topical subject of Biodiversity Net Gain. Our expert speaker today is Julia Baker, who is Biodiversity Technical Specialist at Balfour Beatty and a CIEEM registered by CIEEM, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. Julia has worked on business and biodiversity initiatives for 20 years. She runs professional training courses on Biodiversity Net Gain and metrics and is chair of the forthcoming British Standard on Biodiversity Net Gain. She's also a visiting researcher for Oxford University and a technical advisor for the Institute for Environment and Development. As Principal Co-ordinating Author of the Biodiversity Net Gain Good Practice Principles for Development guidance document, in today's talk, Julia will outline the key principles and good practice for achieving Biodiversity Net Gain. So a huge welcome to Julia. I think you're with us, and thank you for joining us today to provide your insights. If you're all set, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I check you can hear me okay and see my screen?
Yeah, that's all coming through really well and we can see your screen.
Fantastic. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Now, we've got quite a few different professionals on the webinar today, so I just wanted to start off by making sure we're all on the same page. And, well, first of all, what is biodiversity, particularly for us in industry? And in very, very simple terms, biodiversity is all of the habitats, whether they are terrestrial or aquatic, and all of the species that we encounter as we go through and do our work. So in simple terms, it's all about that natural environment and those habitats and species. So when we come to this concept of biodiversity net gain, what do we mean by that exactly? And I think this is a really important point before we kind of delve into how we get there and what's the process and all those things, which is really important. it's actually what is it that we're talking about, and to always have that in mind. Now, here in England, DEFRA have set out an approach and a definition of net gain as part of their mandatory approach for biodiversity net gain in England. And their definition is development that leaves the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. And I really like this because it's so simple. It means because we have been there and built that road or that railway project or that housing development or that energy project or that social infrastructure, whatever that development is, because it's happened, nature, the natural environment is better off. Now, while I love that simplicity, I'm very aware of the huge transformation that that's going to take for us all as a collective professional community to get there. And one of the biggest shifts that we can make is whenever we start a project, to start off with this question: well, how do we plan, design, build, and maintain this development project in ways that achieve biodiversity net gain? And that really is a transformation, because for so long, our industry has followed, in the UK, has followed legal compliance and consent and policy requirements that have allowed development projects to continue with biodiversity loss. Yes, there are laws in place to protect nature, but those laws only protect certain elements. So development has never been the problem. It's been the system that allows development to proceed. And now we're really looking at a very different way of thinking about development, and to really achieve that high level ambition where development actually generates benefits for the natural environment means that we have to think about this incredibly early on, and we have to start off with this question. To help us navigate through this, Sarah mentioned there are good practice principles. So internationally there's good practice principles, but here in the UK, our first set of good practice principles were published in 2016. And there was an accompanying practical guide a couple of years later, and these are freely available on the internet. What we also have in the international community, as well as other biodiversity principles, is one specifically related to people. So when you do biodiversity, either no net loss or net gain, there's good practice associated with people, and we'll touch on this. So in terms of, okay, we've got the high level ambition, we've got these principles, but what does that mean in practice? Particularly my role, as mentioned, I work for Balfour Beatty. We're a contractor, and I work in the major projects unit, which means I work on our major infrastructure projects. So really, what does this mean in practice? The first starting point, and the most important, is we have to know what the concept of net gain does not apply to, and we have to be very, very clear and firm on this. In the UK, irreplaceable habitats and certain statutory designated sites cannot be restored or offset to achieve biodiversity net gain. And what that means is, if a development project affects these features, that's a permanent loss. That's it. We have to acknowledge that. We have to make decisions based on being upfront and look at that in all its ramifications, not just for our generation, but for future generations to come. And I believe that we truly have a responsibility to do that. So it's incredibly important to think about biodiversity net gain as a solution in a certain context of nature. And there's some parts of nature that it does not apply to. And if we affect those features, then that is a permanent loss that forever will be in place. But outside of that, I think the second part is that to recognize that there's a very structured process to achieving net gain, and it's called the mitigation hierarchy. And this is a simple view of the mitigation hierarchy, but it's a series of steps starting off at the left-hand side, when actually your first point is to avoid loss as far as possible. And if you can avoid loss, you lose the net. In biodiversity net gain, you go straight to gain. And net means that overall, after losses and gains, you've landed up with an overall gain. But if you can avoid biodiversity loss, then you go straight to gain. But as we work through this, you first avoid and then minimize the loss as far as possible before remediation and finally offsetting, which is incredibly important to make sure that net gain, particularly when it comes to offsetting, is absolutely justified. And there's no jumping through this and going straight to offsets. We followed this process. And as an industry, we have a duty to present evidence on that. I think what's interesting is that the mitigation hierarchy is actually nothing new. And us here in the UK, our guidelines for ecological impact assessment, they've always been there. We've always worked on the basis of the mitigation hierarchy. What's new and different is this. We start off with this very specific focus in mind. We start off by asking the question, or how can this development project actually help nature? How can we do it in ways that are going to be of an overall benefit? And that's the key transition point for us at the moment. Another key part of the in practice part of net gain is measurable. So when we come to that definition by DEFRA, measurable net gains, the measuring part of it is equally as exciting as it is a slight risk in the process. So if we start off with what's exciting, Natural England in the UK have released Biodiversity Metric 2, their calculation tool, and that's intended to be the metric used for the mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain for England. And I have, honestly, it has just transformed my work. I work in business, I work with engineers, I work with project managers, with various clients, and to be able to talk in terms of numbers and a variety of numbers, to think about percentage increase, to break down these numbers per habitat groups, to show different graphs in terms of, you know, what we're losing, what we're gaining. It's the language of business, and it's certainly been transformational to be able to set these targets, monitor progress towards these targets, but also in that design stage when there are different options on the table, we can quickly see which options are heading towards net gains and which options are heading against it. So there's a huge amount of benefit of using measurable approaches for net gain. But the risk that I mentioned is that we forget we cannot reduce nature to a single number. And we must always bear in mind that nature is inherently rich and complex. And so to use a number only appropriately, and only actually after we fully understood all of the richness and complexities of nature that we're dealing with. And this is particularly important when we have these little pockets of sites that, for whatever reason, might generate low biodiversity units. That's what the currency that the metric works in, but actually quite ecologically important, maybe for the habitat itself, or for the resources that they provide species, not just protected species, but other species as well, or for their functionality, maybe they're a wildlife corridor. And the metric isn't built to capture those things, it's built to help make decisions. So it by no means override the ecology input and the amount of work needed to truly reach net gain. It's just as a help. The other part of a net gain is when we look beyond our development, and one of the principles is make a measurable net gain contribution. And if we can get this right, this is often when I see the real magic happen with biodiversity net gain. So what this means is that we look outside our boundary of our development project, and we look at all the ambitions and plans and hopes and aspirations for nature by our stakeholders within this patch. And this might be the examples on my screen, a biodiversity action plan, or opportunity areas, or conservation target areas. In the UK, we have such an incredible variety of different strategies. And our key focus in the industry when we're designing net gain is, okay, you know, we have a specific net gain target on this project, following through the mitigation hierarchy, but how can we achieve it in a way that makes a wider contribution? And linking our net gain and tying it in with these other wider strategies and plans is absolutely essential to really bring those meaningful and long-lasting benefits. I mentioned people. So there are international principles on, if you're doing no net loss or biodiversity net gain, to really think about the social impacts. And these principles are framed on the basis that we should safeguard as a minimum, and where possible, enhance people's well-being through a net gain approach. And I just want to highlight this because I think it's particularly important to achieve this equal balance between a net gain that's right for biodiversity, but also in one way that has a benefit for people. So if we think about, okay, well, net gain, how can it affect people's well-being? And let's take as an example, we have a village and they live nearby a local woodland. And just as an example, there's another village further away, but a smaller one, and they live next door to a smaller woodland. So a developer comes along and he gains consent, an application to build a hotel in this area. And he achieves some planting around the site. And this is just an example. But he can't achieve all of net gain within the site. So he looks for an offset. So he focuses on the other smaller woodland and boosts it and achieves his net gain within that other woodland as an offset. Now, just as an example, I know this is a really simple case, but just as an example, say that did achieve net gain by following the principles. And so from an ecological point of view, that was okay. And we know that there are instances when offset is the right decision. So say that that's good from a biodiversity point of view. If we now look at it from a people's point of view, the trouble is people at that development site has lost the benefits that they were gaining from woodlands. And that could be from a variety of things. It could have been recreational, it could have been amenity value, it could have been their special place where they go and have family picnics or something like that. Whatever that might be, they've lost those benefits. Yes, other people have benefited from the offset, but they're different. So there's an inequity issue getting on there. But also we know that those other people have benefited, they were fewer and they benefited in different ways. So there's a very much an important point of call to not just think about biodiversity net gain, but really understand the social impacts as well and look at all possible measures to achieve net gain for both biodiversity, but in ways that really safeguard or enhance people's well-being. And most times that I've seen this, sometimes there's a one solution, but often or not, there are a variety of different measures that we need in place for this. And the question that I get asked is, well, surely this would have been picked up before. To some degree, yes, but I'm finding more and more so that this falls through the net because biodiversity net gain tends to be in the hands of people like myself, a biodiversity person. And it's not always the case that the social impacts are actually picked up. But also one point fundamentally, that these good practice principles for people are moving us to measure change in well-being. And here in the UK, we don't do that. We don't measure the impacts of development on people's well-being by any means. Yes, there's big projects that go through EIAs, they will look at health and things like that, but we don't truly understand the impacts of people's well-being. And I love the direction that this is taking us in and fully acknowledge the challenge, but want to embrace it certainly. And there's a working group here in the UK really looking at that and wanting to move forward with that. Very closely related in the good practice principles is principle 9, which is about, okay, you've got prioritise net gain, absolutely. But then really look at how can you optimize the wider environmental benefits for a sustainable society and economy. And this is where I kind of, to my managers, I always talk about, well, look, if you invest in nature, it's like getting 2 for the price of 1, or even 3 or 4, because nature generates so many different things. And there's really interesting calls at the moment for these nature-based solutions to tackle climate change. Now, there's a whole host of interesting questions underpinning this, such as additionality and other aspects like that. But the principle is to really deliver net gain, but then really look at the wider aspects that we can do. And there's a really interesting tool being developed by Natural England here. It's called the ecometric, and it uses the data that you put in our biodiversity metric. And this is a screenshot of the results. It says, well, look, with your biodiversity net gain assessment at the moment, and thinking about the habitats and the changes in the habitats, this is the kind of trends that you're seeing in these various services from nature, which are sometimes called ecosystem services. And I think this is a really exciting development that could really help us make much more informed decisions as well. So those are key points to net gain in practice. And I wanted to finish up with a kind of a where we are now in the UK in terms of planning policy and legislation. So right now, at the moment, our local planning authorities can stipulate biodiversity net gain under the national planning policy framework. It talks very specifically about how planning policies should provide net gains for biodiversity, and many local authorities are, which is it's a really exciting development. There is variation between our local authorities, but they certainly have the powers at the moment to think about the planning policies in this way. And we also have a draft environment bill, which is for England, looking at biodiversity net gain as a mandatory requirement for all developments under the Town and Country Planning Act. And in terms of it, it's answering a lot of questions that I think will bring consistency and standardization across the board, which is certainly very, very welcome. It's setting the numerical definition of net gain as a minimum 10% increase. And it's those biodiversity units that the metric I showed measures in. So it's a minimum 10%. Developers obviously can do more, but it's that minimum. It's maintaining that for a minimum of 30 years and also using that government issued metric to measure biodiversity net gain and work this way through. Now, at the moment, that has been on hold because of COVID-19, but we are expecting the transition of the bill through Parliament to be picked up later this year. There's also a new British standard coming out, and it's in draft for consultation at the moment. So I really encourage everyone to have a look. If you go to the British Standard website, and it's a standard, it's a voluntary standard, but I think all these things really help us move towards this transformation that we're going through, to the ultimate ambition of biodiversity net gain. And having a standard on the process for designing and implement biodiversity net gain is certainly one other help, if you like, one other tool that we can use to move us towards that. So thank you very much for listening. That was a kind of an overview of the key points of biodiversity net gain and where we are in England, and I certainly hope of interest.
Thank you, Julia. That was great, and I thought it was a really good insight into a really important topic, so I hope you all agree. If you haven't already, now's the time to ask a question or two to Julia using the Q&A function within your toolbars. This webinar is scheduled to end at around 2:40 p.m. UK time, but we'll try to get in as many questions as we can before then. So if we start off with some questions that were submitted at registration, you obviously mentioned, Julia, that biodiversity net gain 10% minimum is proposed as mandatory under the UK's new environment bill. There's a question here about whether, do you see this as a sort of game changer? I know you sort of touched on it a little bit there, but do you have anything to add in that sense?
Yes, absolutely, because and it's a really good question, because it can be very challenging, and it's a way of really thinking development through and making sure, I think, a couple of things. So one is, as I mentioned, really not to make this into a numbers game. We have to stand firm on the fact of all those wider good practice principles, such as, you know, what's our contribution going to be? Is it better on or off site? What are the social impacts of biodiversity net gain? So there's a huge advantage of having that number because it sets a consistency and a level playing field, but there's also a lot of responsibility to make sure that we do it in a very genuine way that, you know, provides these meaningful benefits. That is true biodiversity net gain. Excellent.
And in terms of another area where you sort of touched on it before, but it might be useful just to get a bit more insight onto it, is how would you assess the UK government's biodiversity metric 2.0? How could it be improved? I know you thought it was, you were saying how sort of it's changed your work, but I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add there.
So the metric, Natural England issued the metric actually last year as a beta version, and I think they did a fantastic job. They really sought and encouraged feedback on it, and I certainly did give them quite a lot of feedback about it. And so I know that they are currently revising it on that basis. There's still, I mean, the tool itself has a couple of glitches in it, but you know, it's bound to in these early days. I think the most important thing for us now is actually to a couple of things. One is that the purpose of the metric is to measure change in biodiversity, and I think we need a better understanding on how good it actually is at measuring change. And there's a couple of interesting research ideas about, well, can we assess the metric with other methods or the ways of measuring change in habitats and species to have more confidence that that 10% figure is actually right. You know, with that 10%, allowing for confidence limits and all that stuff. Are we confident that that really is the right biodiversity net gain? So I think that there's the metric itself, but then understanding how good it is at measuring change. I think the other thing is there's a couple of things that it doesn't do, and it's really important to not limit that in a net gain design. So it only measures change in direct impacts. It doesn't measure indirect impacts or cumulative impacts, but those certainly should feed into a net gain design in a qualitative way. So that really comes back to the hands of who's using it, and to make sure that they're capturing all of that into the metric. And if you've got a habitat on site that is becoming degraded in a certain way, the metric's not very good at picking that up. So I think, yes, you know, as a starting point, it's fantastic, but as always, you know, there's always room for improving these things.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really good answer, I think. And quite an interesting question here. Do you see environmental net gain as the next clear step on the road from biodiversity net gain?
Do you see what, sorry?
Do you see environmental net gain, which I know has been talked about quite a bit in the UK, as a sort of, do you see that as the next clear step on the road from sort of biodiversity net gain? Do you think that is environmental net gain is something we should be pursuing?
Gosh, that's a really good question. Yes, when the time is right, yeah. But also yes, and to not wait for that perfect moment, because there's never going to be a perfect moment. And to be honest, we started net gain by having a go, and you know, there's so much uncertainty out there. But also, environmental net gain doesn't capture people's well-being. You know, so we can get all the arrows in the ecometric pointing the right way, but we can still have massive social injustices underneath that as well. So I really like the concept of net gain, and I like the way that we kind of build biodiversity net gain first, and then it leads on to that. But for me, the missing part is people's well-being as well, and we have to get a handle on that.
Okay, that all makes sense. Moving on to some questions that have been submitted today. We've got one here. Is the system in Scotland comparable with that in England? Does all the guidance only apply to projects that require planning permission? And is there any obligation to ensure biodiversity net gain for small scale projects?
Oh, yeah, good question. So the outputs from Natural England are obviously related to England, and DEFRA's approach to mandatory approach is just for England. I know of a couple of big energy companies in Scotland that are voluntarily going down the net gain approach, which is fantastic and exciting, and are really leading the way there. I think I'm not 100% up to date on the policy side of things in Scotland, but I think it's at that really exciting stage when people, and rightly so, can really test out and learn lessons from England to really see and understand what's going to work best from Scotland, with, you know, the different environmental priorities and ambition in Scotland. So in a way, watch this space in terms of what comes up for Scotland. And the other one, does all the guidance apply to projects that require planning permission? So the good practice principles apply to anything. It doesn't, they are boundless in the sense of whether you need planning permission or DCO consent or permissive development, doesn't matter. If you're doing or thinking about biodiversity net gain, you can pick up those principles and use them, absolutely. And we certainly encourage them to do that. And finally, is there an obligation to ensure net gain for small scale projects? Natural England are working on a simplified version of the metric for small scale projects. So when the mandatory approach comes out in England, there will be a simplified version. So in the practical guide that I mentioned, and we can send around a link, there's a specific chapter on how to do biodiversity net gain, how to make it happen if you're a small scale project.
Excellent. Yeah, it'd be great to circulate that link. Okay. Just a couple more questions here. We have, does the current method of calculating biodiversity net gain risk simplifying or reducing the diversity of habitat?
Yes, it does. Yeah, and we have to use the metric appropriately. So it's very much to say that we cannot reduce nature to a single number. And I work on very many sites that the metric, it only generates a small number of biodiversity units. And remember that the definition of net gain as a percentage increase is really, really dependent on your baseline. So if you're a pretty small site, but actually locally you're that only green patch in an urban area, so you're really, really important, 10% of a small value is going to be a small value, and the metric isn't designed to capture the richness of nature or what it means for that local area. So definitely we have to use the metric appropriately, and we have to design net gain based on the natural environment. Absolutely. Yeah, no, completely agree with that one.
Brilliant. Just a couple more questions, they're still coming in. So someone here says, could you talk a bit about how biodiversity net gain will be audited when mandatory? Will there be any funding or penalties to encourage or police biodiversity net gain in the future?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a really good question. We don't know the exact details yet. We know that from the communications from DEFRA, there's meant to be a watchdog set up, but unfortunately, we don't know all the details in terms of what that enforcement exactly will be, whether it's on local planning authorities. If it is, what resources they will be given, because we all know local planning authorities are, under-resourced at the moment. So it's a kind of watch this space at the moment.
Okay, that makes sense. Another question here, what is the feeling around the application of net gain wider than the Town and Planning and Country Planning Act, for example, NSIPS?
Yeah, no, great. I mean, what's been interesting is many of the big players who have those, so these are nationally significant infrastructure projects. Many of them have already voluntarily committed to net gain. So the major transport players in the UK, energy providers, water companies. So in a way, they've been front leading this, and they've certainly generated really useful lessons learned to then feed into that mandatory approach. I know there's work in discussion about what will a mandatory approach for NSIPs look like, and I personally think it's essential, because the bigger the project, probably the bigger the impact. And to be honest, if you're a big project with those resources, then you really should be investing in net gain. So it is a watch this space, but also know that there are voluntary commitments out there by the clients who have these types of projects.
Okay, I've got a question here, quite a general question, I suppose, but I think quite important. So how to get benefits of development projects without losing biodiversity net gains? What is the balance between the two?
Yeah,
quite a big question, isn't it?
It is, and it really reflects how we've been as an industry. I mentioned here in the UK, we've been used and if you like, brought up on a consent process that allowed development to proceed with biodiversity loss, and now we are completely transforming that. And the major way to do so is that question that I asked right at the beginning. You have to start your development with that thought in mind. How are we going to plan, budget, program, build, maintain, operate, decommission this project in ways that benefit nature, and there are solutions out there. And it's a way of acknowledging and really addressing trade-offs. I'm not saying any project's a magic solution by any means, and there's probably going to be losses and gains. That's why the net is in there. But overall, we have to have the evidence and the science to give us confidence that overall there will be an overall benefit from that. Because I work in industry, you know, we've got major infrastructure projects on our way, but I do so because I honestly believe that there's a solution when you think about this really early on, and you do it in that way that follows those good practice principles.
Absolutely. A really interesting question here. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer it fully, but we'll give it a go. It says here, so how to implement biodiversity net gain in developing countries like India?
Gosh, yes. No. Yeah. I mean, it's I think starting off as we did here in the UK with think about what is your good practice or what is your best practice. There are international principles. If you go on the Business and Biodiversity Offset website, it closed unfortunately, but they've left so many good legacy projects and international principles that apply to all these things. So when we started here in the UK, it was very much on a test basis, but also very much thinking, what does good look like? And that's your first point of call in terms of what does good look like for us as the mitigation hierarchy. What does good look like, you know, in India in terms of what's excluded? So for here, our irreplaceable habitats are ancient woodlands, amongst others. But if you can start by answering those questions and piece together your principles, and then always come back and revise them as you move forward. But also really think about your metric, you know, how's that going to work that out? But test it, refine it, update it as you go on. And we've been doing that. You know, we didn't start off with a perfect answer by any means. So yeah, and do let us know how things go.
Okay, that's it was a really good answer, I think. Another question here, I think you sort of touched on it a bit, but whether you have anything to add here is, do you think major infrastructure projects will be in scope at some point? So sort of in the scope, I guess, for net gain applying to them.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, a lot of the major clients that we're seeing have made voluntary commitments to net gain anyway. And I think, and you know, that the mandatory approach to net gain in England is just the starting point. And I know that there've been assessments of the implications of net gain for larger major projects as well. But that doesn't stop us having a conversation. You know, we always have a conversation with our clients, even if they haven't asked us for net gain. Literally, I will knock on their door and say, I think we should think about this, because there's such a clear business case behind it. You know, and if you can relay that, and if you could translate that to your client, it's like, well, of course. So yes, absolutely.
Excellent. I've just got a couple more questions. So what is the most innovative biodiversity solution that you've come across in a development recently? Is innovation helping in this space?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Well, okay, a couple of things. I think actually because so net gain in England is all about habitats. The metric that we have just measures change in habitats, and it does so by thinking about type and extent and conditions, all of those interesting things. But so essentially it's about habitats. So the innovation is actually really, really simple. It's getting us back to that build it and they will come. If you can just find the right habitat in the right place, which isn't a fancy engineering solution by any means, it's purely working with nature. I think there's a wonderful simplicity in that to get us to net gain. But saying that, there are some really, really interesting engineering solutions that I've seen. I've seen some fantastic green bridges. I've seen some great green walls popping up in what is typically a very heavily engineered world of bridges or structures or, you know, whatever that infrastructure might be. And I've seen some really interesting designs based on allowing more green space into that.
Sounds like some really interesting stuff going on. Finally, probably the final question for me, it's quite a sort of fun question, I think. So there's a question here, who is your biodiversity idol?
Gosh, that, you know what, that is the best question ever. So there's one person that you might not know, but she means everything. Well, I mean, you probably should know, but she's just been so inspirational. So I mentioned the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, and it was headed up and led by the wonderful Kerry. And so if you read anything by Kerry Ten Carter, she has such a vision and an insight, and she's so brilliant, and she always knows how it works. You know, whenever I've been panicking or I just get, you know, you just can't find your way with a particular project, she's just there with that guiding, overarching thought and guidance. So Kerry really has been, my absolute inspiration. So Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, Kerry Ten Carter, Katah. She's absolutely fantastic. So now I'll go with her.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Julia, for spending time with us today and for providing such an insightful talk and really good answers to all the questions, I thought. So thank you so much, and thank you for all your questions, everybody. Now, before you all disappear, I just have some further opportunities you might be interested in. Tomorrow we have the second part of the biodiversity webinar series. Joining us will be expert environmental professionals from Anglian Water, ARIP and Canary Wharf Group. Hear what actions they have taken to enhance biodiversity and get inspired. This will be followed by the final part of the series on Thursday, where we will hear from Becky Fisher of Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. Becky's going to be providing some really great insight, into the Trust approach to engaging the public on biodiversity, which focuses on behaviour change and community empowerment. So to book your place on any of these webinars, make sure to visit the website address on your screen now. And on the topic of biodiversity, we also have our recently launched Biodiversity website hub, developed in collaboration with key partners. Here you will find tons of resources and inspirational ideas on how you can help to protect and enhance the biodiversity that we all live amongst. We're looking for actions large and small, and they all make a really positive difference. So to get involved, please visit socm.org.uk/biodiversity 2020. And then later this year, our next webinar series will be based around the topic of natural capital. So if you are a CM or RM Tech and you have a project that you'd like to showcase and allow other environmental professionals to learn from, some tips that other sectors should consider in their work, or guidance on how you've implemented relevant standards and frameworks, please get in touch with me. If you're interested to hear more about the CM or RM Tech registers, please take a look at our How to Become and Why Become recorded webinars on our website. There you'll also find all the recordings from our last series, which was around climate change. They are also available on the Society for the Environment YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to gain notifications of new webinar recordings and other SOCM content. The recordings for this series, including today's webinar, will also be available shortly. Next up, annually we showcase the achievements and commitment to environmental good practice of our registrants via our awards. The nominations are now closed and the finalists have been decided. For the first time this year, we have 2 awards up for grabs, the Environmental Professional of the Year and the new award for 2020, the Registrant Newcomer of the Year. The announcement of the award winners and highly commended finalists will be an online affair this year, taking place on Friday, the 5th of June, which is World Environment Day, at 4 p.m. UK time. For this, I'd like to encourage you to join the live announcement on Zoom and show your support for the outstanding work of the finalists. It's a free event, so please register your attendance via the website address on your screen now. And that's it from us today. Thank you for listening and taking part, and for all your amazing questions. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to gain notifications of new videos, and tap on the big thumbs up like button. That would be great. And many thanks again to Julia for her excellent talk. And we will see you in the next webinar, which is tomorrow. So don't miss it. Thank you for watching and stay safe. Thank you.